The genesis of the Tao of Physics was a singularly beautiful moment that Dr. Capra experienced one late summer afternoon many years ago. Sitting by the ocean, watching the waves rolling in and feeling the rhythm of his breathing, he suddenly became aware of the whole environment as being engaged in a gigantic cosmic dance. Being a physicist, he knew that the sand, rocks, water, and air around him were made of vibrating molecules and atoms. He knew that these consisted of particles which interacted with one another by creating and destroying other particles. He also knew that the Earth's atmosphere was continually bombarded by showers of cosmic rays, particles of high energy undergoing multiple collisions as they penetrated the air. All this was familiar to him from his research in high-energy physics, but until that moment, he had only experienced it through graphs, diagrams, and mathematical theories. But as Dr. Capra sat on that beach, his former experiences came to life. He saw cascades of energy coming down from outer space, in which particles were created and destroyed in rhythmic pulses. He saw the atoms of the elements and those of his body participating in this cosmic dance of energy. He felt its rhythm and heard its sound. And at that moment, he knew that this was the dance of Shiva, one of the oldest and most popular Indian gods, the Lord of dancers worshipped by the Hindus. According to Hindu belief, all life is part of a great rhythmic process of creation and destruction, of death and rebirth. Shiva's dance symbolizes this eternal life-death rhythm which goes on in endless cycles. In the words of Ananda Koamarswamy, Shiva, quote, rises from his rapture and dancing sends through inert matter pulsing waves of awakening sound, and lo, matter also dances, appearing as a glory round about him. Dancing, he sustains its manifold phenomena. In the fullness of time, still dancing, he destroys all forms and names by fire and gives new rest. This is poetry, but nonetheless science. Unquote. The dance of Shiva symbolizes not only the cosmic cycles of creation and destruction, but also the daily rhythm of birth and death which is seen in Indian mysticism as the basis of all existence. At the same time, Shiva reminds us that the manifold forms in the world are Maya, not fundamental, but illusory and ever-changing, as he keeps creating and dissolving them in the ceaseless flow of his dance. Modern physics has shown that the rhythm of creation and destruction is not only manifest in the turn of the seasons and in the birth and death of all living creatures, but is also the very essence of inorganic matter. More than that, the dance of creation and destruction is the basis of the very existence of matter. Modern physics has revealed that every subatomic particle not only performs an energy dance, but also is an energy dance, a pulsating process of creation and destruction. For modern physicists, then, Shiva's dance is the dance of subatomic matter. As in Hindu mythology, it is a continual dance of creation and destruction involving the whole cosmos, the basis of all existence and of all natural phenomena. Hundreds of years ago, Indian artists created visual images of dancing Shivas in beautiful bronze sculptures. In our time, physicists have used the most advanced technology to portray the patterns of the cosmic dance. The bubble chamber photographs of interacting particles which bear testimony to the continual rhythm of creation and destruction in the universe are visual images of the dance of Shiva equaling those of ancient Indian artists in beauty and profound significance. The metaphor of the cosmic dance thus unifies ancient mythology, religious art, and modern physics. It is indeed, as Koamarswamy said, poetry, but nonetheless science. That experience on the beach, and many experiences that followed it in succeeding years, helped Dr. Capra to gradually realize that a consistent view of the world is beginning to emerge from modern physics, a view which is harmonious with ancient Eastern wisdom. The essential purpose of this program is to explore the relationship between the concepts of modern physics and the basic ideas in the philosophical and religious traditions of the Far East. Let us then now begin our exploration of that relationship. Modern physics has had a profound influence on almost all aspects of human society. It has become the basis of natural science, and the combination of natural and technical science has fundamentally changed the conditions of life on our Earth, both in beneficial and detrimental ways. Today, there is hardly an industry that does not make use of the results of atomic physics, and the influence these have had on the political structure of the world through their application to atomic weaponry is well known. However, the influence of modern physics goes beyond technology. It extends to the realm of thought and culture, where it has led to a deep revision in our conception of the universe and our relation to it. The exploration of the atomic and subatomic world in the 20th century has revealed an unsuspected limitation of classical ideas and has necessitated a radical revision of many of our basic concepts. For example, the concept of matter in subatomic physics is totally different from the traditional idea of a material substance in classical physics. The same is true for concepts like space, time, or cause and effect. These concepts, however, are fundamental to our outlook on the world around us, and with their radical transformation, our whole worldview has begun to change. These changes, brought about by modern physics, have been widely discussed by physicists and by philosophers over the past decades, but very seldom has it been realized that they all seem to lead in the same direction, towards a view of the world which is very similar to the views held in Eastern mysticism. The concepts of modern physics often show surprising parallels to the ideas expressed in the religious philosophies of the Far East. When we use the phrase Eastern mysticism, we refer to the religious philosophies of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism. Although these comprise a vast number of subtly interwoven spiritual disciplines and philosophical systems, the basic features of their worldview are the same. This view is not limited to the East, but can be found to some degree in all mystically oriented philosophies. More generally, modern physics leads us to a view of the world which is very similar to the views held by mystics of all ages and traditions. Mystical traditions are present in all religions, and mystical elements can be found in many schools of Western philosophy. The parallels to modern physics appear not only in the Vedas of Hinduism, in the I Ching, or in the Buddhist sutras, but also in the fragments of Heraclitus, in the Sufism of Ibn Arabi, or in the teachings of the Yaqui sorcerer Don Juan. The difference between Eastern and Western mysticism is that mystical schools have always played a marginal role in the West, whereas they constitute the mainstream of Eastern philosophical and religious thought. If physics leads us today to a worldview which is essentially mystical, it returns, in a way, to its beginning 2,500 years ago. It is interesting to follow the evolution of Western science along its spiral path, starting from the mystical philosophies of the early Greeks, rising and unfolding in an impressive development of intellectual thought that increasingly turned away from its mystical origins to develop a worldview which is in sharp contrast to that of the Far East. In its most recent stages, Western science is finally overcoming this view and coming back to those of the early Greek and the Eastern philosophies. This time, however, it is not only based on intuition, but also on experiments of great precision and sophistication, and on a rigorous and consistent mathematical formalism. The roots of physics, as of all Western science, are to be found in the first period of Greek philosophy in the 6th century BC, in a culture where science, philosophy, and religion were not separated. The sages of the Milesian school in Ionia were not concerned with such distinctions. Their aim was to discover the essential nature or real constitution of things which they called physis. The term physics is derived from this Greek word and therefore originally meant the endeavor of seeing the essential nature of all things. The view of the Milesians was very close to that of ancient Indian and Chinese philosophy, and the parallels to Eastern thought are even stronger in the philosophy of Heraclitus of Ephesus. Heraclitus believed in a world of perpetual change, of eternal becoming. For him, all static being was based on deception. His universal principle was fire, a symbol for the continuous flow and change of all things. Heraclitus taught that all changes in the world arise from the dynamic and cyclic interplay of opposites, and he saw any pair of opposites as a unity. This unity, which contains and transcends all opposing forces, he called the Logos. The split of this unity began with the Eleatic school, which assumed a divine principle standing above all gods and men. This principle was first identified with the unity of the universe, but was later seen as an intelligent and personal God who stands above the world and directs it. Thus began a trend of thought which ultimately led to the separation of spirit and matter, and to a dualism which became both a characteristic and an essential element of Western thought and philosophy. A dualism between mind and matter, between body and soul. As the idea of a division between spirit and matter took hold, the philosophers turned their attention to the spiritual world rather than the material, to the human soul and the problems of ethics. These questions were to occupy Western thought for more than 2,000 years after the culmination of Greek science and culture in the 5th and 4th centuries BC. The scientific knowledge of antiquity was systemized and organized by Aristotle, who created the scheme which was to be the basis of the Western view of the universe for 2,000 years. But Aristotle himself believed that questions concerning the human soul and the contemplation of God's perfection were much more valuable than investigations of the material world. The reason the Aristotelian model of the universe remained unchallenged for so long was precisely this lack of interest in the material world, and the strong hold of the Christian Church, which supported Aristotle's doctrines throughout the Middle Ages. The birth of modern science was preceded and accompanied by a development of philosophical thought which led to an extreme formulation of the spirit-matter dualism. This formulation appeared in the 17th century in the philosophy of René Descartes, who based his view of nature on a fundamental division into two separate and independent realms, that of mind and that of matter. The Cartesian division allowed scientists to treat matter as dead and completely separate from themselves, and to see the material world as a multitude of different objects assembled into a huge machine. Such a mechanistic worldview was held by Isaac Newton, who constructed his mechanics on its basis and made it the foundation of classical physics. From the second half of the 17th to the end of the 19th century, the mechanistic Newtonian model of the universe dominated all scientific thought. It was paralleled by the image of a monarchical God who ruled the world from above by imposing his divine law on it. The fundamental laws of nature searched for by the scientists were thus seen as the laws of God, invariable and eternal, to which the world was subjected. The philosophy of Descartes was not only important for the development of classical physics, but also had a tremendous influence on the general Western way of thinking up to the present day. Descartes' famous sentence, "Cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I exist, has led Westerners to equate their identity with their mind, instead of with their whole organism. The mind has been separated from the body and given the futile task of controlling it, thus causing an apparent conflict between the conscious will and the involuntary instincts. This inner fragmentation mirrors our view of the world outside, which is seen as a multitude of separate objects and events. The natural environment is treated as if it consisted of separate parts to be exploited by different interest groups. The fragmented view is further extended to society, which is split into different nations, races, religious, and political groups. The belief that all these fragments, in ourselves, in our environment, and in our society, are really separate can be seen as the essential reason for the present series of social, ecological, and cultural crises. It has alienated us from nature and from our fellow human beings. It has brought a grossly unjust distribution of natural resources, creating economic and political disorder. It has created an ever-rising wave of violence, both spontaneous and institutionalized, and an ugly, polluted environment in which life has often become physically and mentally unhealthy. The Cartesian division and the mechanistic worldview have thus been beneficial and detrimental at the same time. They were extremely successful in the development of classical physics and technology, but had many adverse consequences for our civilization. It is fascinating to see that 20th century science, which originated in the Cartesian split and in the mechanistic worldview, and which indeed only became possible because of such a view, now overcomes this fragmentation and leads back to the idea of unity expressed in the early Greek and Eastern philosophies. In contrast to the mechanistic Western view, the Eastern view of the world is organic. For the Eastern mystic, all things and events perceived by the senses are interrelated, connected, and are but different aspects of manifestations of the same ultimate reality. Our tendency to divide the perceived world into individual and separate things, and to experience ourselves as isolated egos in this world, is seen as an illusion which comes from our measuring and categorizing mentality. It is called avidya, or ignorance, in Buddhist philosophy, and is seen as the state of a disturbed mind which has to be overcome. In the words of Ashvaghosha, quote, "When the mind is disturbed, the multiplicity of things is produced, but when the mind is quieted, the multiplicity of things disappears." Unquote. Although the various schools of Eastern mysticism differ in many details, they all emphasize the basic unity of the universe, which is the central feature of their teachings. The highest aim for their followers, whether they are Hindus, Buddhists, or Taoists, is to become aware of the unity and mutual interrelation of all things, to transcend the notion of an isolated individual self, and to identify themselves with the ultimate reality. The emergence of this awareness, known as enlightenment, is not only an intellectual act, but is an experience which involves the whole person and is religious in its ultimate nature. For this reason, most Eastern philosophies are essentially religious philosophies. Before studying the parallels between modern physics and Eastern mysticism, we have to deal with the question of how we can make any comparison at all between an exact science, expressed in the highly sophisticated language of modern mathematics, and spiritual disciplines which are mainly based on meditation and insist on the fact that their insights cannot be communicated verbally. What we want to compare are the statements made by scientists and Eastern mystics about their knowledge of the world. What we need to clarify are these 2 points: the nature of the knowledge involved and the language in which this knowledge is expressed. Throughout history, it has been recognized that the human mind is capable of 2 kinds of knowledge, or 2 modes of consciousness. These have often been termed the rational and the intuitive, and have traditionally been associated with science and religion, respectively. In the West, the intuitive, religious type of knowledge is often devalued in favor of rational scientific knowledge, whereas the traditional Eastern attitude is in general just the opposite. The following statements about knowledge by two great minds of the West and the East typify the two positions. In Greece, Socrates made the famous statement, "I know that I know nothing." In China, Lao Tzu said, "Not knowing that one knows is best." In the East, the values attributed to the two kinds of knowledge are often already apparent from the names given to them. For example, the Hindu Upanishads speak about a higher and a lower knowledge, and associate the lower knowledge with various sciences, the higher with religious awareness. Buddhists talk about relative and absolute knowledge, or about conditional truth and transcendental truth. Chinese philosophy, on the other hand, has always emphasized the complementary nature of the intuitive and the rational, and has represented them by the archetypal pair yin and yang, which form the basis of Chinese thought. Accordingly, two complementary philosophical traditions, Taoism and Confucianism, have developed in ancient China to deal with the two kinds of knowledge. Rational knowledge is derived from the experience we have with objects and events in our everyday environment. It belongs to the realm of the intellect whose function it is to discriminate, divide, compare, measure, and categorize. In this way, a world of intellectual distinctions is created, a world of opposites which can only exist in relation to each other, which is why Buddhists call this type of knowledge relative. Abstraction is a crucial feature of this knowledge, because in order to compare and to classify the immense variety of shapes, structures, and phenomena around us, we cannot take all their features into account, but have to select a few significant ones. Thus, we construct an intellectual map of reality in which things are reduced to their general outlines. Rational knowledge is thus a system of abstract concepts and symbols, characterized by the linear, sequential structure which is typical of our thinking and speaking. In most languages, this linear structure is made explicit by the use of alphabets, which serve to communicate experience and thought in long lines of letters. The natural world, on the other hand, is one of infinite varieties and complexities, a multi-dimensional world which contains no straight lines or completely regular shapes, a world where things do not happen in sequences, but all together, a world where, as modern physics tells us, even empty space is curved. It is clear that our abstract system of conceptual thinking can never completely describe or understand this reality. In thinking about the world, we are faced with the same kind of problem as the cartographer who tries to cover the curved face of the earth with a sequence of flat maps. We can only expect an approximate representation of reality from such a procedure, and all rational knowledge is therefore necessarily limited. Because our representation of reality is so much easier to grasp than reality itself, we tend to confuse the two and to take our concepts and symbols for reality. In the West, the semanticist Alfred Korzybski made exactly this point with his powerful slogan, "The map is not the territory." What the Eastern mystics are concerned with is a direct experience of reality which transcends not only intellectual thinking, but also sensory perception. Such knowledge is called absolute knowledge by Buddhists because it does not rely on the discriminations, abstractions, and classifications of the intellect, which are always relative and approximate. It is, so we are told by Buddhists, the direct experience of undifferentiated, undivided, indeterminate suchness. Complete apprehension of this suchness is not only the core of Eastern mysticism, but is the central characteristic of all mystical experience. The fact, obvious from any reading of the newspapers that humanity has not become much wiser over the past 2,000 years, in spite of a prodigious increase in rational knowledge, is ample evidence of the impossibility of communicating absolute knowledge by words. As Chuang Tzu said, if it could be talked about, everybody would have told their brother. Absolute knowledge is thus an entirely non-intellectual experience of reality, an experience arising in a non-ordinary state of consciousness which may be called a meditative or mystical state. Although physicists are mainly concerned with rational knowledge and mystics with intuitive knowledge, both types of knowledge occur in both fields. Rational knowledge and rational activities certainly constitute the major part of scientific research, but they are not all there is to it. The rational part of research would, in fact, be useless if it were not complemented by the intuition that gives scientists new insights and makes them creative. These insights tend to come suddenly and, characteristically, not when sitting at a desk working out the equations. They come when relaxing, in the bath, during a walk in the woods, on the beach, etc. During these periods of relaxation after concentrated intellectual activity, the intuitive mind seems to take over and can produce the sudden clarifying insights which give so much joy and delight to scientific research. However, intuitive insights are of no use to physics unless they can be formulated in a consistent mathematical framework, supplemented by an interpretation in plain language. Abstraction is a crucial feature of this framework. It consists of a system of concepts and symbols which constitute a map of reality. This map represents only some features of reality. We do not know exactly which these are, since we started compiling our map gradually and without critical analysis in our childhood. The words of our language are thus not clearly defined. They have several meanings, many of which pass only vaguely through our mind and remain largely in our subconscious when we hear a word. The inaccuracy and ambiguity of our language is essential for poets, who work largely with its subconscious layers and associations. On the other hand, science aims for clear definitions and unambiguous connections, and therefore it abstracts language further by limiting the meaning of its words and by standardizing its structure in accordance with the rules of logic. The ultimate abstraction takes place in mathematics, where words are replaced by symbols, and where the operations of connecting the symbols are rigorously defined. In this way, scientists can condense information into one equation, that is, into one single line of symbols, for which they would need several pages of ordinary writing. The scientific method of abstraction is very efficient and powerful, but we have to pay a price for it. As we define our system of concepts more precisely, as we streamline it and make the connections more and more rigorous, it becomes increasingly detached from the real world. Again, using Korzybski's analogy of the map and the territory, we could say that ordinary language is a map which, due to its intrinsic inaccuracy, has a certain flexibility so that it can follow the curved shape of the territory to some degree. As we make it more rigorous, this flexibility gradually disappears. With the language of mathematics, we have reached a point where the links with reality are so tenuous that the relation of the symbols to our sensory experience is no longer evident. This is why we have to supplement our mathematical models and theories with verbal interpretations, again using concepts which can be understood intuitively, but which are slightly ambiguous and inaccurate. If there is an intuitive element in science, There is also a rational element in Eastern mysticism. However, the degree to which reason and logic are emphasized varies enormously from one school to the other. For example, the Hindu Vedanta or the Buddhist Madhyamika are highly intellectual schools, whereas Taoists have always had a deep mistrust of reason and logic. Zen, which grew out of Buddhism but was strongly influenced by Taoism, prides itself on being without words, without explanations, without instructions, without knowledge. It concentrates almost entirely on the experience of enlightenment and is only marginally interested in interpreting this experience. A well-known Zen phrase says, "The instant you speak about a thing, you miss the mark." Although other schools of Eastern mysticism are less extreme, the direct mystical experience is at the core of all of them. Even those mystics who are engaged in the most sophisticated argumentation never see the intellect as their source of knowledge, but use it merely to analyze and interpret their personal mystical experience. The firm basis of knowledge on experience in Eastern mysticism suggests a parallel to the firm basis of scientific knowledge on experiment. This parallel is further enforced by the nature of the mystical experience. It is described in the Eastern traditions as a direct insight which lies outside the realm of the intellect and is obtained by watching rather than thinking, by looking inside oneself, by observation. In Taoism, this notion of observation is embodied in the name for Taoist temples, Kuan, which originally meant to look. Taoists thus regarded their temples as places of observation. In Chan Buddhism, the Chinese version of Zen, enlightenment is often referred to as the vision of the Tao, and seeing is regarded as the basis of knowing in all Buddhist schools. A word of caution should perhaps be added here. The emphasis on seeing in mystical traditions should not be taken too literally. It has to be understood in a metaphorical sense, since the mystical experience of reality is an essentially non-sensory experience. When the Eastern mystics talk about seeing, they refer to a mode of perception which may include visual perception, but which always and essentially transcends it to become a non-sensory experience of reality. The parallel between scientific experiments and mystical experiences may seem surprising in view of the very different nature of these acts of observation. Physicists perform experiments involving an elaborate teamwork and a highly sophisticated technology, whereas mystics obtain their knowledge purely through introspection, without any machinery, in the privacy of meditation. Furthermore, scientific experiments seem to be repeatable any time and by anybody, whereas mystical experiences seem to be reserved for a few individuals at special occasions. A closer examination shows, however, that the differences between the two kinds of observation lie only in their approach and not in their reliability or complexity. Anybody who wants to repeat an experiment in modern subatomic physics has to undergo many years of training. Only then will he or she be able to ask nature a specific question through an experiment and to understand the answer. Similarly, a deep mystical experience generally requires many years of training under an experienced master, and, as in the scientific training, the dedicated time does not alone guarantee success. If the student is successful, however, he or she will be able to repeat the experiment. In fact, the repeatability of the experience is essential to every mystical training and is the very aim of the mystic's spiritual instruction. A mystical experience, therefore, is not any more unique than a modern experiment in physics. On the other hand, it is not less sophisticated either, although its sophistication is of a very different kind. the complexity and efficiency of the physicist's technical apparatus is matched, if not surpassed, by that of the mystic's consciousness, both physical and spiritual, in deep meditation. The scientists and the mystics, then, have developed highly sophisticated methods of observing nature which are inaccessible to the layperson. A page from a journal of modern experimental physics will be as mysterious to the uninitiated as a Tibetan mandala. Both are records of inquiries into the nature of the universe. Although deep mystical experiences do not, in general, occur without long preparation, direct intuitive insights are experienced by all of us in our everyday lives. We're all familiar with a situation where we've forgotten the name of a person or place or some other word and cannot produce it in spite of the utmost concentration. We have it on the tip of our tongue, but it just will not come out. Until we give up and shift our attention to something else. Then suddenly, in a flash, we remember the forgotten name. No thinking is involved in this process. It is a sudden, immediate insight. In our everyday life, direct intuitive insights into the nature of things are normally limited to extremely brief moments. Not so in Eastern mysticism, where they are extended to long periods and, ultimately, become a constant awareness. The preparation of the mind for this awareness, for the immediate, non-conceptual awareness of reality, is the main purpose of all schools of Eastern mysticism, and of many aspects of the Eastern way of life. During the long cultural history of India, China, and Japan, an enormous variety of techniques, rituals, and art forms have been developed to achieve this purpose, all of which may be called meditation in the widest sense of the word. The basic aim of these techniques seems to be to silence the thinking mind and to shift the awareness from the rational to the intuitive mode of consciousness. In many forms of meditation, this silencing of the rational mind is achieved by concentrating one's attention on a single item, like one's breathing, the sound of a mantra, or the visual image of a mandala. For most people, and especially for intellectuals, this mode of consciousness is a completely new experience. Scientists are familiar with direct intuitive insights from their research because every new discovery originates in such a sudden nonverbal flash. But these are extremely short moments which arise when the mind is filled with information, with concepts and thought patterns. On the other hand, in meditation, the mind is emptied of all thoughts and concepts, and is thus prepared to function for long periods through its intuitive mode. When the rational mind is silenced, the intuitive mode produces an extraordinary awareness. The environment is experienced in a direct way without the filter of conceptual thinking. Eastern mysticism is based on direct insights into the nature of reality, and physics is based on the observation of natural phenomena in scientific experiments. In both fields, the observations are then interpreted, and the interpretation is very often communicated by words. Since words are always an abstract, approximate map of reality, the verbal interpretations of a scientific experiment or of a mystical insight are necessarily inaccurate and incomplete. Modern physicists and Eastern mystics alike are well aware of this fact. In physics, the interpretations of experiments are called models or theories, and the realization that all models and theories are approximate is basic to modern scientific research. Thus, the aphorism of Einstein, quote, "As far as the laws of mathematics refer to reality, they are not certain. And as far as they are certain, they do not refer to reality," unquote. Physicists know that their methods of analysis and logical reasoning can never explain the whole realm of natural phenomena at once, and so they single out a certain group of phenomena and try to build a model to describe this group. In doing so, they neglect other phenomena, and the model will therefore not give a complete description of the real situation. The Eastern mystics, too, know that all verbal descriptions of reality are inaccurate and incomplete. The direct experience of reality transcends the realm of thought and language. And since all mysticism is based on such a direct experience, everything that is said about it can only be partly true. In physics, the approximate nature of all statements is quantified, and progress is made by improving the approximations in many successive steps. How, then, do the Eastern traditions deal with the problem of verbal communication? First of all, mystics are mainly interested in the experience of reality, and not in the description of this experience. They are therefore generally not interested in the analysis of such a description, and the concept of a well-defined approximation has thus never arisen in Eastern thought. If, on the other hand, Eastern mystics want to communicate their experience, they are confronted with the limitations of language. Several different ways have been developed in the East to deal with this problem. Indian mysticism, and Hinduism in particular, clothes its statements in the form of myths, using metaphors and symbols, poetic images, similes, and allegories. Mythical language is much less restricted by logic and common sense. It is full of magic and of paradoxical situations, rich in suggestive images, and never precise, and can thus convey the way in which mystics experience reality much better than factual language. According to Ananda Komaraswamy, quote, "Myth embodies the nearest approach to absolute truth that can be stated in words," unquote. The rich Indian imagination has created a vast number of gods and goddesses whose incarnations and exploits are the subjects of fantastic tales, collected in epics of huge dimensions. The Hindu with deep insight knows that all these gods are creations of the mind, mythical images representing the many faces of reality. On the other hand, he or she also knows that they were not merely created to make the stories more attractive, but are essential vehicles to convey the doctrines of a philosophy rooted in mystical experience. Chinese and Japanese mystics have found a different way of dealing with the language problem. Instead of making the paradoxical nature of reality palatable through the symbols and images of myth, they prefer very often to accentuate it by using factual language. Thus, Taoists made frequent use of paradoxes in order to expose the inconsistencies arising from verbal communication and to show its limits. They have passed this technique on to Chinese and Japanese Buddhists who have developed it further. It has reached its extreme in Zen Buddhism with the so-called koans, those nonsensical riddles which are used by many Zen masters to transmit the teachings. Whenever the Eastern mystics express their knowledge in words, be it with the help of myths, symbols, poetic images, or paradoxical statements, they are well aware of the limitations imposed by language and linear thinking. Modern physics has come to take exactly the same attitude with regard to its verbal models and theories. They, too, are only approximate and necessarily inaccurate. They are the counterparts of the Eastern myths, symbols, and poetic images. For example, the same idea about matter is conveyed to the Hindu by the cosmic dance of the god Shiva as to the physicist by certain aspects of quantum field theory. Both the dancing god and the physical theory are creations of the mind. They are models to describe their author's intuition of reality. The notion that all scientific models and theories are approximate and that their verbal interpretations always suffer from the inaccuracy of our language was already commonly accepted by scientists at the beginning of this century, when a new and completely unexpected development took place. The study of the world of atoms forced physicists to realize that our common language is not only inaccurate, but totally inadequate to describe the atomic and subatomic reality. Quantum theory and relativity theory, the two bases of modern physics, have made it clear that this reality transcends classical logic and that we cannot talk about it in ordinary language. The problem of language encountered by the Eastern mystic is exactly the same as the problem the modern physicist faces. Both the physicist and the mystic want to communicate their knowledge, and when they do so with words, their statements are paradoxical and full of logical contradictions. These paradoxes are characteristic of all mysticism, from Heraclitus to Don Juan, and since the beginning of this century, they are also characteristic of physics. In atomic physics, many of the paradoxical situations are connected with the dual nature of light, or, more generally, of electromagnetic radiation. On the one hand, it is clear that this radiation must consist of waves, because it produces the well-known interference phenomena associated with waves. Here's what happens. When there are two sources of light, the intensity of the light to be found at some other place will not necessarily be just the sum of that which comes from the two sources, but may be more or less. This can be explained by the interference of the waves emanating from the two sources. In those places where two wave crests coincide, we shall have more light than the sum of the two. Where a wave crest and a wave trough coincide, we shall have less. The precise amount of interference can easily be calculated. Interference phenomena of this kind can be observed whenever one deals with electromagnetic radiation, and force us to conclude that this radiation consists of waves. On the other hand, electromagnetic radiation also produces the so-called photoelectric effect. When ultraviolet light is shown on the surface of some metals, it can kick out electrons from the surface of the metal, and therefore it must consist of moving particles. A similar situation occurs in the scattering experiments of X-rays. These experiments can only be interpreted correctly if they are described as collisions of light particles with electrons. And yet, they show the interference patterns characteristic of waves. The question which puzzled physicists so much in the early stages of atomic theory was how electromagnetic radiation could simultaneously consist of particles, that is, of entities confined to a very small volume, and waves which are spread out over a large area of space. Neither language nor imagination could deal with this kind of reality very well. Please fast forward to the end and turn the tape over for proper cueing of side 2. Eastern mysticism has developed several different ways of dealing with the paradoxical aspects